everyone. Welcome back to Range of Reality. I'm Jody Salerno, and today's podcast is going to be a great one. I have a good friend of mine, Sam Rosenberg, here today. Sam's an author, a speaker, and an internationally recognized expert on personal security. Hi, Sam. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Jody. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your new book, Live Ready.
Yeah, so as you know from kind of my short bio that I appreciate you being so kind with, my background, in a nutshell, has been protecting people and organizations and teaching them how to protect themselves for the greater part of almost the last 30 years. When I had a little bit of a philosophical shift back in 2003, that to me, it's good to have a lifeguard, but ultimately you should know how to swim. And I started to shift gears from protecting people to really teaching them how to protect themselves. I engaged in this process in a way of really wanting to teach people the same skills and tools we use to protect public figures. And it's been an interesting 20-some years now doing that. And the book, Live Ready, is designed to be a culmination in many ways of the most important lessons learned that I have learned, not only protecting people, but also teaching and dealing with people with real-world situations. And, you know, in a way that is achievable and sort of accessible, if you will, to anybody from any walk of life. So the book breaks down basically how to protect yourself. It's designed as a guide, and it is a guide for the modern world. You know, how do you protect yourself in this uncertain environment that we are in, whether we're dealing with everyday street crime or targeted violence, and how do we actually get our arms wrapped around this so that we can better protect our friends, our families, ourselves in this uncertain world. And that's what the book is really all about.
Yeah, that's a lot of good topics. People need to know this stuff. There's so much danger out there. Sam, you bring a really nice different approach because, you know, I teach a lot. I teach women. I teach mostly firearms. I don't do the hand-to-hand. Then I know you teach firearms also, but you bring a different perspective. You bring that whole corporate security aspect to your training, which is pretty cool. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was what can people do to assess whether a situation, when they're in it, if they could specify whether someone's a threat or not. How do you know if someone's a threat, or can you give us some ideas or tactics on that?
You know, Jody, I mean, it's obviously you and I have known each other for a long time, a lot of mutual respect. I really appreciate how you approach the topic of personal security, particularly with women. And yeah, I mean, we cross over on some aspects, firearms and whatnot, but the reality of it is, to answer your question, you know, if we think about personal security from the way I look at it, the most important aspect of personal security is not to get into trouble, you know, to avoid the danger. But in order to avoid danger, you really have to be able to recognize danger early on, because, you know, we don't control very often, or entirely, I should say, the ability to avoid being targeted. That is something that the bad guy controls. You know, in so many different instances, we can do everything right. We can treat people with respect, try to avoid going down the dark alleys, and have good situational awareness and all these things. But the reality is the bad guy decides whether they're going to target us. And I usually refer to two extreme examples just to anchor the concept. One is in the workplace, when, let's say, you have to fire someone and you do it in the most dignified, professional way humanly possible to set someone on a positive trajectory and preserve their dignity and to give them a path forward. It just has to come to an end there. You do everything you can, and still 6 months, 18 months later, that person can come back and go to their CEO, their manager, or whatever, and say, when you fired me, you destroyed my life. You know, the domestic version of that is, if I can't have you, no one can. So the concept here is that so many times we can do everything right and still find ourselves in the crosshairs, so to speak. To answer your question specifically, how do we know if a threatening situation is in fact dangerous? And this gets into a concept that I talk about, threat assessment. You know, threat assessment is basically the notion of trying to determine if someone who is making threats or acting in a threatening manner, in fact, poses a threat. And there's a very big difference between the two. Lots of people make threats or act in threatening manners. Not everyone poses a threat. So it really depends on the circumstance of how we drill down on this. But if we're talking about just everyday personal security for your listeners and, folks who you train with and saying, what can I give them as a tool? What I would say is you want to trust two factors. The first factor is this, when we talk about situational awareness, I always tell people that paying attention is just the prerequisite. You have to be out of your phone. You have to be paying attention, or you're simply going to shut off all of your senses that would normally be able to alert you to danger. But assuming that you actually have your awareness sort of turned on and you recognize that there's something wrong, the way someone looks at you or approaches you, and you get the hair standing up on the back of your neck, you get that intuitive vibe that something is not right, to me, that is your first warning indicator that you may be being targeted, okay? It is the first warning sign of what we classically in my company, we call being interviewed. And sometimes it doesn't progress past that point. And sometimes tactically, you want to cross the street or avoid the contact. Sometimes that is not appropriate or not accessible. So what you have to do is have a further gauge to know, when do I actually now have to address this interview for what it is? And that generally comes by way of proximity, meaning someone approaches you. And when someone starts to get into your personal space or, close to you to the point where your warning bells are going off, you now have to address that situation. You can't just hide from it, not make eye contact and pretend that it's not happening. This is the biggest danger in most scenarios, is that people don't understand that the interview process of the bad guy, whether they're someone who uses force to get what they want or someone who uses persuasion and charm to get what they want, is if we mismanage the interview, we are effectively sending a signal that we are an easy and inviting and soft target. And that is exactly what the bad guy's trying to establish. Would this person make a good target, or would they not? Would they be too difficult? So part of what we want to be able to do is recognize that even though we can exhibit good behavior in a personal security sense as often as possible, we can't always avoid being targeted. But we can do is recognize the warning signs that we're being interviewed and immediately start to address those interviews properly so that we are not seen as an easy, soft, inviting target. Does that make sense, Jody?
It does. And everything starts with your intuition, your gut. You have to pay attention to it.
Jody, one of my favorite definitions for intuition is simply knowing without knowing why. In certain books like Gavin DeBecker's seminal book on The Gift of Fear, some of these books are great on really giving people permission to trust their intuition, right? Even when you don't know why the warning bells are going off, give yourself permission to trust that. I try to teach that to kids a lot, because a lot of times kids are almost negatively reinforced. They're almost taught not to trust their instincts. And, you have to almost give people permission and say, look, when you get a bad feeling, there's probably something there. This is one of your rules. I saw your one pager on, 10 things. Isn't that rule number 1, right?
Yeah, it is. Trust your gut. Trust your gut. It'll tell you, and it has your best interest at heart always.
It's such an important quality. And, Jody, it's funny. I mean, I know you work with a lot of women, mostly women. You certainly work with men too, but, and I do as well, right? But the concept is women definitely are more attuned to this.
Yes.
Kind of funny because I think guys have a tendency to think, I am so situationally aware, but men and women really live in different worlds. And it's kind of funny. If you ask a group, a mixed group, and you say to the guys, when was the last time you felt fear? The guys will very often say, well, there was one time in college or, one time back in 10 years ago. And when you ask that same question to women, very often the answer is like this morning, last Tuesday. The prevalence of how often women feel a degree of insecurity is far greater than guys. And it doesn't mean that both men and women shouldn't have the right training. They absolutely should. But I think often it's easier to work with women because they're already aware there's a vulnerability and they know how to pay attention.
Right. And for women, I mean, we have a lot harder time defending ourselves than men because of our stature and things like that. And I think with women, and you're right, women have a better intuition, but I think the issue a lot of times with women is we're taught to be nice, and that's the issue. They don't want to try to use their voice. They don't want to try to rock the boat. They don't want to try to be rude. So nice is going to get them in trouble. So that's what they run into.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And I would say, not to put like absolutes to things, because sometimes you are better off being nice or polite, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't want to cross certain lines of, I would call it lines of disrespect where it becomes a challenge, right?
Right.
But I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that women need to be polite. When you're being interviewed, and certainly in situations when it's someone you don't know, you have no obligation to, you need to be forceful, and you need to demonstrate that you are not going to be an easy target. And I always try to tell people that what bad guys are looking for, that no matter how desperate the bad guy is, they are not looking for a challenge. They're looking for an easy, soft target. They're looking for an easy victim. And they don't want to be in a fight. They want to victimize someone. And there's a really critical difference here, because I think most people, like you, me, most people who are upstanding, decent people, believe it or not, we're all very competitive. It's part of our nature. And that's why people achieve. But bad guys are shockingly non-competitive. They don't want to be in a competition. They want it to be entirely one-sided. And to them, the definition of a good soft target is one that cannot or will not fight back. And the challenge with politeness is that, you know, we get into what I call the veils of denial, meaning that when we are being interviewed, one of the most common things that people fall into psychologically is what I call the veil of normalcy. All right. The veil of normalcy is this idea of normalcy bias. Normalcy bias is basically wanting things to be normal, even when there's evidence directly to the contrary. So the way it manifests is, you know, say we're walking down the street and someone approaches us and we get that hair standing up on the back of our neck and that intuition that something's not right. What our brain has a tendency to do is to look for all the evidence. And if we can't articulate internally why our intuition is warning us, we have a tendency to just, you know, sort of dismiss it or minimize it. We say, oh, it's probably nothing. I'm overreacting. And this is all normalcy bias coming into play, because what we really want is for things to actually be normal. We don't want it to be a dangerous situation. And that sort of veil of denial tends to make us very vulnerable. The only appropriate response is actually to simply pay attention. Just acknowledge it. You don't have to dismiss it. You don't have to minimize it. Maybe your gut tells you to cross the street or avoid this person, and you may want to follow that advice. But the concept is just not dismissing it is huge. The second component is we get into what I call the social veil, or the veil of reciprocity. Those are two separate ideas. The social veil is where we inhibit our intuition by saying things like, but I don't want to judge a book by its cover. And we start worrying about, am I being biased in my thinking, things like that. The critical aspect of avoiding bias is understanding the difference between sort of scarcity and normal thinking, meaning that if every time I see someone who is of a certain ethnicity, I have a negative impression and I feel fear, that's probably biased thinking. It may very well be biased thinking that's predicated on life experience or prior victimization. Some of those things are just, it is what it is. It's been conditioned. Not saying it's good. I'm saying that you can recognize it for what it is. But if you don't have those thoughts, and you don't routinely have those thoughts, and someone approaches you, immediately dismissing your intuition because you don't want to feel like you're being biased is part of that veil of that social contract, okay? The social veil. We're literally putting an inhibition in place that would limit our ability to protect ourselves. But then when we talk about being nice, it's what I consider the veil of reciprocity. Now this topic can get just a little bit complex, but here's the way I think of it. And I hate those models that say there's two kinds of people in the world, right? But the concept is, if we're just for simplicity saying that in the world, in our society, and most around the country, the world rather, we have two general sort of like groups of people. We have what we would call decent people and indecent. There's no further demarcation needed. To me, decent people are functionally, like me, you, and just about everyone we know, is wound around the concept of basic courtesy. So being nice to each other, holding the door, being polite, there's a certain courtesy that is the glue that holds our society together and keeps all of us functioning with one another. The thing is that indecent people may see courtesy or kindness as weakness, and they very often do. And for them, the demarcation psychologically is respect. If you disrespect me, then I'm almost forced to escalate matters. And if you show me kindness, it's only because you're deferring, you're showing me deference, as in you're afraid of me or you respect me. So the balancing act of what does it mean to be forceful or firm in your boundaries and to be able to say no and to be aggressive is we want to balance being not necessarily being nice, but also not necessarily being overly aggressive and rude. Does that make sense?
Because that's a hard one to teach too. It is
very hard. It's really an experiential thing. But the challenges, like I'll share a story with you. I had a friend of mine who has been through a very minimal amount of training with me. She and her daughter, I think, did some training a long time ago. I saw her the other day, and she shared with me this story, how this is someone who comes from a degree of difficult life experiences, okay? She was in a retail store, and it was generally a women's clothing store, and there was a guy there. And she was telling me the story about how she sees this guy there, and, you know, her intuition said, something's not right about this. Why is this guy here? Is he lurking around? Is he looking for a target? And she kind of went into this very defensive mode. And she said what she did was she literally just stared at him, you know, gave him a real hard stare to alert him that she was aware of him and, you know, kind of presenting that forcefulness of like, why are you here? And this guy kind of reacted to that and ended up sort of escalating matters, and it turned into one of these things where there was a lot of yelling and screaming, and she ended up having to flee the store because she thought this guy might actually attack her. Well, as we're dissecting this, I was trying to explain to her, I said, look, the challenge here is, you know, he wasn't necessarily doing anything to her, right? And it wasn't really like she needed to thereby forcefully put up these boundaries and say, no, you need to back away from me. She almost sought the issue out because she felt like he didn't belong there, right? And whatever her warning bells were going off, she chose to rise into that challenge and take that on her own responsibility. And what it did was it triggered this kind of reaction of escalating hostilities, because he felt like, well, who the hell are you to tell, you know, why are you eyeballing me, right? So the challenge is we can sort of go the wrong direction here. I don't want any woman to feel like she has to be polite, right? I have a daughter, I have a wife. I don't want anyone in my sphere to think that they must be polite. You got to know when to be forceful and when to establish boundaries and reinforce those boundaries. But the challenge is you got to be careful, too, that you don't engage someone in a way that can cause a whiplash effect of potential escalation because someone feels disrespected. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes total sense. No, I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, she might very well have escalated something that wasn't there. So I get it. And it's a very hard thing to teach. Once people understand it, then they get it. But it is very hard. And I think it's harder, like you had mentioned, kids. I think that's even harder because, you know, we as parents want our kids to be polite. I just did a podcast on child trafficking. I talk about, you know, the kids, you got to teach your kids scripts, and they need to be firm, and they need to walk away and say, no, thank you, and I can't help you. And yeah, there's a real balance there.
To me, the critical junction is when it's appropriate to be firm. Like, let me give you a very practical question that comes up all the time with me is I'll have people routinely ask me, and they're walking around downtown, whatever the scenario is, and they say, well, you know, I make it a habit of making eye contact with people because I want to make sure that, you know, they know I'm aware of them. Just that can be triggering for some potential bad guys. What I try to tell them is, in the close protection world, what we always do is we look at the face and we look at the hands. So I want to be able to look at someone's body language and read intent, right? Which is to basically give my visual cortex the ability to more accurately gauge intuitively what's going on. But I also want to see the practical things like, is he holding a weapon or his hands hidden? What am I dealing with here? And the concept is, as soon as I see someone's face and I've got enough of a read there, I don't make eye contact. I'm looking at their chest. And just that shift of focus is enough to keep potential bad guys recognizing that you're aware of them, but not like making eye contact. It's kind of like dogs, right? If you make prolonged eye contact with a dog, they might consider it a threat or a challenge. It's no different. So the nuance of this is sometimes tactical. Where are you looking and how are you looking? From the standpoint of setting boundaries, I love what you just said. And it comes back to the notion that no is a complete sentence, right?
Yes,
so,
yes, it is.
And getting young people to understand, when you say no, I'm not interested in going out with you. I'm not interested in going to a party with you. I'm not interested in going upstairs in the frat house, whatever it is. And someone persists, right, and is trying to talk you out of that. What they're clearly saying is they don't care what you want. They only want what they want. And they're simply using manipulation to try to override your no. And that should be a clear indication that you are in trouble. That is a advanced interview dynamic that you have to recognize early on and say, this person is trying to manipulate me and establish some degree of control or privacy over this situation. I've already said no, and that means it's a hard no. Really reinforcing that. And again, that comes back to the intuition. To me, once you have made those decisions and you're trusting your gut, default to that. Does that make sense to you as well, Jody?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, you mentioned the book Gavin de Becker's Gift to Fear, and I love that book. I think everyone should also read that book, including your book. He breaks it down into things like forced teaming and things like that people would never even think about, but they experience it in their everyday lives, or the unsolicited promise. How many times do people say, hey, I'll promise I'll leave after I help you carry your groceries up to your apartment? They seem so innocent, but those are manipulative. Yeah. I think people need to keep training, continue training. And I think more people need to train. I think people hear situational awareness and they're like, oh yeah, I look around, I see who's here, I see what cars are here. It goes so much deeper than that. And self-awareness is 98% of self-defense. You'll probably agree with that. You're going to win the fight you never get into.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's, and I'll go one step further and say that, I remember one of my friends who is one of the most well-traveled people, former Navy SEAL, former CIA operator overseas. He said something to me one time that I loved. He says, Sam, with all my experience, I've come to the conclusion that running away is the most underrated self-defense tactic out there, And I always remember him saying that because it's like people think that the purpose of self-defense is to be tough enough or good enough to beat someone up or, it's not. It's really to create an opportunity to escape. And that's no different if we're looking at self-defense or personal security at, say, the executive protection level, like what I was used to doing. If I'm protecting someone like Tom Cruise or protecting someone like Warren Buffett, both people who I've protected, I can tell you, we're all capable and trained and we're able to use weapons and tactics and whatever else. But the reality is, if we get to that point, we've already failed. What we really want to do is be able to recognize the danger early and get off the X, get away so that there is no possibility of an attack. What I classically refer to as denying opportunity. And, denying opportunity is all of the stuff we're talking about. It's being able to fine-tune your awareness, pay attention, trust yourself that when you think something's wrong, default to that, and then take action, right? What training, I think, why training is so important. Because people could train with you for years and become super proficient with a firearm. And I would say that most people who buy guns, and I'd ask you the same question, but my perspective is most people who buy guns for defense, for self-defense, do not invest enough time and resources to become truly proficient with that tool.
I agree.
it's really almost a problem. And they don't realize how intense a situation can be and how much adrenaline can affect that. And if those skill sets are not as automatic as driving a car, you are going to be behind the eight ball really fast. And so people need to do more training. But I'll tell you, from my perspective, Jody, training is a gateway. It is physical in nature, it's mental in nature, but really the purpose is to ensure that you can think and make good decisions. That's the only way you can achieve that.
You're going to fall back to your level of training. You're not going to rise to the occasion. And
That's
you're
right.
absolutely right. And I tell my students, and I'm so glad they're learning how to use a gun, and they'll take the intro to shooting class, which gets them nowhere near being able to conceal carry a firearm. But a lot of them feel like, okay, I went back, I shot a 22, I'm good. They're putting themselves in more of a dangerous situation. That's what I tell them. You go, if you want to go buy a gun and you're going to load it and you're going to carry it and you don't know how to use it, you're putting yourself in more danger. Don't even carry the gun. Yep. Because, usually, if something happens, they're going to use the gun against them. They're going to lose control of that firearm, and it's going to be used on them. So, no, training, everything has to be muscle memory. Like I said, with kids, they need scripts that are muscle memory. They need to know automatically what to say to an adult or another child if they feel threatened. It's just all muscle memory.
Yeah. And, I'd even go so far to say that even from the home defense standpoint, because I've encountered this same as you, people come in, they want to do a 101 class, right? Give me the intro to firearm safety and handgun handling, whatever it is, right? I want the 3-hour crash course. And they do the crash course and they figure, well, I'm never going to carry it because I don't want to do carried concealed. So I just want it for home defense. And they think suddenly that they're good. And it's like, in my opinion, it's one of the biggest issues is that people just have a flawed belief system into how much training it really requires to use a firearm, understanding the legalities, understanding how to diffuse a situation, understanding how to manage a situation that does not require a firearm. Not every situation is a nail that requires a hammer, which is why we work so well together because, we're both approaching this with the same logic, but we're approaching it from the standpoint of sometimes my focus is more on the unarmed side of things and your focus is more on the armed side. And that's logical too, by the way, because, for women, quite frankly, as much as I want them to know how to defend themselves with their bare hands, and it's critical they need to know that, truly, I want them to have a tool, period, end of story. Any martial artist that says, you can take away someone's size and strength advantage, these are flawed belief systems. With a woman dealing with a bigger, stronger guy, functionally speaking, I want her to have a tool that will provide a force multiplier and allow her to deal with that situation very decisively, especially if there's more than one bad guy.
Well, let me ask you your opinion on this, because I'm sure you see it, and we're talking about tools. I am not a fan of the taser, because the tasers that they're selling these girls at these at-home parties, I thought were going to put them more in danger. They're not going to stop the threat, and you're getting within arm's length. But I do see a lot of women specifically that have a false sense of security. There are a lot of instructors out there, Sam. There are great instructors, and there's instructors that really shouldn't be out there instructing. So if these students aren't vetting their instructors for armed or unarmed, I do see women, or men. I mean, I'll give you an example. I'll see someone walking in with a gun that's in the wrong holster, that they can't even get it out of their holster in the waistband. And I'm like, why are you carrying that fire? Why do you have this holster? And they're like, well, I went and took one free class at so-and-so. And, we learned everything we had to learn. And I'm thinking, you're putting yourself in danger. So. Oh,
yeah. It's the Wild West, Jody.
It is.
Here's the funny thing. Back when I first got started, now this is how freaking old we are. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. I showed how old I am, okay? But I mean, you and I are both like Gen Xers, right? But we grew up before the internet and all this kind of stuff. And the funny thing is, when I first started this, pre-internet and all that, it was like impossible to find good training. And what you had two extremes. You had karate, or you had really sketchy, basic NRA trainers, right? Where one trainer was more competent than another, and there was very little standardization. And it was really hard to find good instruction unless you went somewhere that had a very reputable reputation that was more of like a national level academy, right? It was just hard to find good training. It was real. And nowadays, the problem is you can't walk outside and throw a stick without it hitting someone who is holding themselves out to be the next greatest expert on weapons, tactics, whatever. And most of what they're doing is regurgitating stuff that they've seen on YouTube videos or whatnot. It is a very, very Wild West kind of situation, and it's a let the buyer beware market. And the sad part is that someone who knows a tiny amount can seem to know a lot to the uninitiated. It's hard for people to find the right trainers, because instead of having no trainers that are really good out there, nowadays there's so many trainers, it's hard to differentiate who actually is good and who's not. In fact, one of the chapters in Live Ready, and I did this deliberately because I can't write a book with integrity that is trying to teach physical skill sets. I can teach soft skills. I can teach tons of information that is absolutely critical to know in that book. I'm not going to make it into a martial arts handbook and say, here's how you get someone off you who's choking you. Those are physical skills that need to be taught ideally in person or at least well online, right? So you can practice it in some fashion. In one of the last chapters of the book, I break down my logic for how anyone can vet a competent instructor. And it's not just show me your certifications or are you insured or any of these basic things. What it really comes down to is being able to sort of deal with that person in such a way to know what to look for and how to look to see whether what they're teaching would actually apply in the real world. Right. And, that's the good thing with all these instructors. I'll just say this. The good thing, though, is the bar has been raised, right? There are more competent instructors teaching more competent information because there's more organizations out there teaching a standardized approach to this is how you hold and shoot a gun. This is how you draw it from a holster. It's a little less defined when it comes to the self-defense skills and the soft skills, but it's becoming a little bit better. And that's the good thing about the information age that we have with the internet. You know how many times I've heard other firearm instructors say something like, well, I'd rather be tried by 12 than carried by 6.
I hate hearing that, Sam.
It is the most asinine thing I've heard, because you say that until you're on trial.
Yep.
All right. And you face losing everything you've worked for your whole life, your family and everything else, because you didn't know the difference between a situation that required force and a situation that required deadly force. If the instructor doesn't even know how to explain the basic legalities of when, how, and why it's appropriate to use a tool or a deadly force or a force technique, your instructor can only teach you mechanics, and your ability to apply is really a function of guesswork. You're hoping and guessing.
Because there's still the whole thing about the castle doctrine. That is such a gray area. I hear it still all the time. Oh, if they're in my house, I'm going to kill them and I'll drag them outside. No, that's not going to happen.
Or vice versa, right?
It's not going to, yeah, it's not going to happen. Maybe back, 50 years ago before forensics, but no. And they all think, oh, castle doctrine, I can just shoot you if you're in my house. And then you start explaining the reasons why you can't. So yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of people carrying guns that have no idea how a gun works, though, either. So.
Yep. What's the old saying? Choose your health care as if your life depends on it. You have to choose your trainer as if your life depends on it.
You do.
At the end of the day, you have to choose it very, very carefully. And what I would actually say is, for people who are confused about that, or how do I vet those programs, check out my book. And I think it's like it's probably the second to last chapter where I get into that in depth. Here's a method, a very simple method of evaluating and vetting. Is this training or this trainer competent, right? Is it going to meet my needs? What are your needs? And is it going to meet my needs? So, that's kind of my contribution to that.
Yeah, because everybody's different. Like you said, biggest thing is, my background's competition shooting. I was a sponsored shooter. And I tell people, just because someone was a cop, just because they're in the military, or just because they're a sponsored shooter, doesn't mean that that relates to the real world. It doesn't. None of that does. The cops aren't acting like a civilian. When I'm out there shooting targets, they're not shooting back. And the same with the military. It's a whole different game. But I wanted to mention, though, too, also, you have online classes. So tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, so this is a new thing for us. I know it's like online training has been out there for a long time now. So this is kind of, I would say, 15 years in the making. I've been talking about doing this. And one of the challenges I've always had, Jody, is just like with writing Live Ready, the challenge that I've had is what can I deliver in this format that would be legitimate, that is not, something that people will not be able to achieve. And when I decided to do an online course, which we just released literally about 2 weeks ago, what I decided to do was to take my most popular training programs, the clinics that I teach, that I know have great efficacy because they're simple and easy to do, easy to learn, and easy to master, into a degree of gross motor muscle mechanic that'll work under pressure. And I decided to take those programs and to redact it into an online course. And it actually became something fairly sizable. The course is probably a 10 to 12 hour course total, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's an extraordinarily content-rich program. What I did was I organized in a way to say, okay, here is the material. This is what you need to know, how to do it. Walk through the physical tactics in a live setting, where I had a live audience going through so people can actually see what the development curve is. And each of the drills in sequence. This is how you develop the first part of the movement, the second part of the movement, and develop the whole movement. And I kept the techniques to the clinic type techniques I teach, which are simple, digestible, easy to learn, gross motor movements that anybody can learn and will remember and can rely on in a pinch. For example, I know it sounds to maybe the average trainer ridiculous, but it's not. I teach a simple gun disarming technique in this program as an example. But it's not just here's how you disarm a gun, it's why it works, what the reaction time dynamics are, the distance dynamics, how to do it first person, third person, whether it's handgun, long gun. And the technique is so simple that I've taught this to school teachers and to, workplaces. And I've literally had school teachers that I taught 8 years ago, 10 years ago, come back and go, I still remember that technique. And they show me that they can still do it perfectly. I remember teaching a school there, one of the first ones I taught back in probably 2003, 2004, so almost 20 years ago. It was about 10 years later, I was teaching at a Safe Schools conference in Harrisburg. A young woman came up to me and she says, I remember when you taught my school 10 years ago, and I had just finished this presentation, and I grabbed, a red gun, one of our inert training tools. It's just a piece of plastic, right? But it looks like a gun. In front of a whole bunch of people, I said, really? And I grabbed this gun, I pointed at her, I said, show me. And she instantly did the gun disarm almost perfectly to the way she would have done it had she been practicing for the last 10 years. And she was like, oh, I can't believe I remembered that. She's like, I thought I remembered it, but it was like she did a perfect execution. So when techniques are simple enough and they're actually wired into the way our body is designed to learn things and to retain information in a gross motor fashion, you can do it under stress. You can do it without a lot of training. And even if it's been a long time since you've seen it, once it's in the memory banks, it literally is like riding a bike. Like your body knows how to get back on and do it.
And tell them how they can find you, Sam. How can we find you?
Yeah. So the easiest way is either go to my website, which is liveready.co, or go to any of the social media platforms at livereadyco, and you'll find me. So liveready.co or livereadysolutions.com. You can also Google me and find me very easily. You can find the book on Amazon. I always direct people there because it's the easiest way to get it. You can also get it directly from me if you want a signed copy. Easiest thing, just go to any social media platform, livereadyco or at livereadyco, or just go to my website, liveready.co.
So great having you on, Sam. I can't wait till you come back into the range and start teaching your students here.
Yeah, we're going to do some great collaborations, Jody. We've been talking about it for too long. And
I know, because we both bring a unique flavor to what we do. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. I love what you do. I absolutely love what you do and how you do it. I think you're doing great work, especially now that you're reaching people through this podcast and your written material. I got to tell everybody, if you haven't downloaded Jody's safety kit, what do you call it, Jody?
The safety checklist kit.
Yeah, just as a really great, well done, well presented summation in modular format. Here's what you need to know for personal security. Here's what you need to know for your home. I would encourage anyone listening to this, go to Jody's site and download that kit. It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Sam. I appreciate that. So that's it for today, guys. So if you found this episode helpful, please hit subscribe so you never miss a show. Share with someone who needs this message. The more we spread awareness, the more lives we protect. And you can always find me at rangeofreality.com. Thanks again, Sam. I hope to see you soon.
See you soon, Jody.
I'd like to tell you about my sponsor. It's my sponsors that allow me to do this podcast, so please support them. If you ever have to defend yourself, the fight doesn't end when the threat is gone. Legal trouble, court cost, lost wages, it all adds up fast.
And that's where the United States Concealed Carry Association comes in.
They provide award-winning self-defense training and education, but more than that, they've secured liability insurance for their members that helps cover bail, legal fees, and other critical costs after an incident. So if you care about protecting what matters, visit
usconcealedcarry.com
and see why peace of mind is part of being prepared.